So, Lisa Reisman, founder, CEO of MetalMiner. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. You embarrassed me this morning when we were chit-chatting about, do you remember when we talked 6 years ago or whenever it was? And I was trying to place exactly when and where I spoke with you. So, my apologies.
I'm glad I made an impression. But I was probably one of 30 that you talked to that day.
I think you were truly a startup at that point. Startup.
We were young.
Yeah.
I think it was I want to say 2019.
Okay.
Something like that.
Might have been a while ago.
You were nice to take the call.
Okay. As long as I was nice.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
What is MetalMiner?
Great question. Thank you. So MetalMiner, I would say it's interesting. We've even kind of transformed ourselves from where we started. We basically do metal price market intelligence, really with a focus on the forecasting piece. So what's the market going to do? We are an informal, what I call informal PRA, price reporting agency. Our prices are not typically used as the contracting mechanism, but we are following the IOSCO. There's all these guidelines in Europe, and so that your data is legitimate, how you collect your data, that you have proper licensure for your data, and that kind of thing. So
you can't just throw any number out there and charge for it, kind of thing.
No, nor can you scrape off the internet and charge for it. There's a lot of people that do that. So
that create these databases based on pirating information,
or they'll take trade data. I have a funny story that I have to share about PRAs. I didn't even know what one was, a price reporting agency. So I started this in 2008, and I didn't know what a PRA was. I was at a business meeting. It was kind of at somebody's vineyard, and it was like an informal dinner, and it was friends. And I was in another country, and someone introduced me to someone, and I said, oh, yes, I run the company MetalMiner. And this guy says, no way. In which I started laughing because I was like, okay, I'm like in the Middle East here. How in the world do you know MetalMiner?
Did you think he was pulling your leg?
Yeah,
Okay.
completely. And then he said, whoa, you're in this book on price reporting agencies. You're like in chapter 5, and you're written all over it. You're in the front and the back. And I looked at him, and I thought he had 3 heads. I'm like, what are you talking about? So I went home, went to Amazon, ordered this book called Price Reporting Agencies by Wayne Johnson, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at the CME Group. So I get this book, and I don't know anything. This was not very long ago. I'm embarrassed to say it was like maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what a PRA was. I didn't know what IOSCO was. It's a European government agency that kind of oversees how companies report their prices, how they gather data, that whole thing.
Okay.
So I'm reading this book, and I'm being informed by somebody who knew us, but I didn't even know what they were. So it actually helped us transform how we basically cleanse and, are legitimate with the data that we collect. And there's a whole big thing on it now because of AI. People are scraping and taking information, and then they think they have a good answer. They've scraped it. You actually have to license data if it's not yours. You have to get derivative data license rights. You have to get distribution rights. You have to get display rights. There's a way to do it. And then there's also how do you collect the data. So a lot of what we do is we look at trade data. And so we have a whole process around that. So anyway, I didn't know that we were a price reporting agency until literally somebody told me that story, or we had that story, and he shared that book, and I read that book and thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. And
were you kind of upset you were in chapter 5 and not chapter 1?
No, because chapter 5 was the metals chapter.
Okay, just making sure you.
But
I
felt super stupid when I met this guy because I literally, when he said price reporting agency, I didn't even know what he meant.
Well, then let's back up. So you've told us what you are, but let me put this into a practical term. So maybe tell me when I'm wrong, which is MetalMiner is a program. Are we talking software program or
I think of it as a data company.
Okay, a data company where people would contract or purchase your data to use to help them understand how to price things in the future or what markets would be doing in metal?
That's some of it for sure.
Okay, so give me, so I can understand, kind of very pedestrian or use case,
Yeah.
so I can really kind of understand.
Okay. So I would say the main thing that we help companies understand is price. So dealing with price volatility.
Okay.
So I'm an OEM. I've got a $500 million or $1 billion worth of spend, and my steel prices and my aluminum prices are gyrating, going up and down, 6-7%, 10%. I mean, they go all over the place, right? Managing that volatility. Now I'm on a contract, and I'm using another PRA, not us, and my contract is tied to that, and so now I'm taking on that market movement. I'm going up and down, riding that roller coaster.
Got it.
But the CFO wants to know, like, hey, let's manage this better. Are we keeping within our budget? How are we compared to the budget? And that.
So they're basically being tied to LIBOR or something with this contract. I mean, there was an index.
There's an index.
That what they're paying was going up and down with that.
Correct.
Okay.
That's one of the things. The other thing that we really help companies with is I'm negotiating with my supplier for my annual contract, and I need some leverage to go into that negotiation. And certain markets, and you know these markets, so stainless steel is a great example of a very opaque market. It's not like you can go somewhere and easily find out how much the vinyl adder costs, or how much this gauge or that gauge or this width should cost, or how much extra it is. So we provide that kind of intelligence so companies can walk into a meeting or walk into a discussion with a mill and at least be able to anchor the price or question what the supplier is telling them.
Right.
So I would say that's a core use case. And I think the other piece is then, yes, the forecast. What's the market going to do? Because that's going to dictate how I'm going to buy. We also have something for the spot market, though.
Yes, tell me about that.
Yeah, we do give a monthly outlook where we give an indication of where we think the underlying metal price is going to trade between basically a floor and a ceiling.
Okay.
And then if the price goes above the ceiling or below the floor, that's the cue that the buyer has to change their buying strategy. So if we see, for example, aluminum breaks out of what we call a resistance range, and you're only buying as needed, we might say, hey, we might be coming into a longer-term uptrend. You might want to take cover because we think the market's going up. So go ahead and buy forward, and then we give a recommendation. How much forward should you buy? Maybe just a month or two, maybe 3 months. Every once in a while, we give a longer one, right? 6-9 months out. Like the market is going crazy.
So these companies are really making decisions.
Exactly.
Which is why you need so much licensing or certification, because you have a lot of people.
You have to make sure you're distributing the data in a legal manner. That's the first thing. But also people come to, first of all, they start with us just sort of like, okay, let's see about what these weirdos are talking about. We'll see. And I think over time they learn to trust it because it's backed with a great track record. So if you follow the guidance, and I give an example from last year. When copper ran up really high in May of 2024, we fielded some panic calls.
Yeah.
And we help companies, and people said, what should I do? And we're like, we think it's short-lived. Take a breath. Don't make all your orders right now when the market is riding. And it was like a short-term, less than 30-day kind of pop, and then the market came back down. So helping companies understand the noise from the signal, I think, is really important. And I don't think we've had that historically. And that's not where price reporting agencies have ever played well. So that's, I think, the niche where we've found ourselves in. And I think that's the one that people are looking after now because the volatility has been so much in so many markets.
This couldn't be a larger topic in my mind, that you, from the outside looking in, it may not be clear why all the pricing complexity in the first place. Like,
great question.
Why is this not more simple than it is? And is there a way to answer that? Do you have an answer?
Yeah, I do actually. So it's interesting, and I don't know how long you've been in the steel industry. So I've been in the metals industry since 1994, more or less. I did a consulting stint for 6 years, but I was always on the metal projects, but that's a different story. So if you think about aluminum prices, more or less traded around, I'm going to make up a number, $2,100 to $2,350 a ton, more or less. Steel, hot rolled coil, used to trade between, I'm going to make up the number, 350 to 550 or 350 to 500 a ton until 2004.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in 2004? China entered in a big way, World Trade Organization, and became a major player, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And so what we saw is their demand was so huge, it usurped everybody else's demand, and it became what happened to the price. And that's literally when the volatility started. I chalk it up to China.
Yeah.
And not in a blame way, but just life was much simpler with less volatility. When the world became more globalized, we all traded, inherited, et cetera, trends going on in other countries into our commodities. So.
Yeah. And the other part that I think makes it really complex is the difference in price that a U.S. distributor will pay for that metal versus maybe like a Russian distributor or like,
oh yeah,
it's massive. The differences that, and I'm talking like way pre-tariff. I'm talking,
yes,
basically forever since we were able to bring it in. And I was at a mill in China, and he was laughing literally about how much we pay for their metal.
Wow, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
It was like, what? He's like, yeah. He goes, you guys think it's all like we make you these special recipes? He's like, it's all the same stuff, And I was just like, good to know.
Interesting. So Russia, I think, was the first. So when I started in the industry, I'm going to sound like I'm 800 years old.
We know you're not.
Okay, so Russia started shipping semi-finished aluminum material to the U.S. in the early 90s, like around 94. And there was always a delta between not just the price, but there was a quality delta too, until much later. And then Russian material and a lot of semi-finished aluminum material from Russia was equivalent or better than. In some cases, they could make things that we couldn't even make. So, you saw like that quality thing. And I think, if you were trading back when I was in the late 90s, there was like the Asian Tigers. Mm-hmm. And those countries were also exporting. And we were still in an era where like the quality wasn't quite there across the board, especially like Thailand, Taiwan at the time. Now it's all changed. But yes, so you'd see these huge price differentials. And yes, the American market had always been pretty protected, particularly for steel. It's more international for aluminum and stainless a little bit, but definitely for steel, you see big gaps between the U.S. and...
Well, it used to be easy to say, well, that Chinese steel sucks. Like it's not good. You can't say that.
You can't say that anymore.
You can't say it anymore.
No.
It's you're just not being truthful. When you go over there and look at those mills, you're like, there's like 3 people working there in this. They're just cranking out. It's so high tech.
Right.
And it's so you kind of can't hang your hat on that. Like maybe we once were able to do it.
Right.
But let me interrupt and say, okay, so you're at MetalMiner, founder, CEO of MetalMiner. Let's talk a little bit about how you got there, because you didn't start there.
It's a series of accidents.
Yeah. Well, that's a common tale, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody wakes up and says, I think I want to be in the metals industry when they're a child.
No.
Like no one ever, right?
I think that's 100%. I've always said like that's the one thing everyone in the metals industry has in common is they didn't plan to be in it.
No, not at all. And as we were chit-chatting before, so my path was, it's interesting, if you go really far back, I was like a broadcast journalism major, and I wanted to get into politics, and I went to D.C. and I had a legislative job as an assistant at a trade association.
Really?
Yes. And
did you have someone in mind? You're like, I want to do what they do.
I wanted to be like a corporate lobbyist. I wanted to like sort of influence policy. And so the first kind of issue, I worked for a retiree organization. I have to say the name because it's a funny name. It's called NARF.
NARF.
That was my first job. National Association of Retired Federal Employees.
That was the cause.
That was my cause. Well, actually, I got a couple of job offers to work on the Hill, but And at that time, the starting salary was $16,000 a year. So you're not eating very much for 16 grand a year. So I took this job off the hill for $21,000 a year. So a lot more.
Percentage basis, you crushed it.
I crushed it.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. And like in that little brief time, I had a chance, like I actually had lunch with John McCain. I thought I was like super cool. Back then, everything was like a liquid lunch. I won't get into that.
Yeah.
But you would work on one issue, and that's all you would focus on. So my issue was universal health care. And at the time, Hillary Clinton was the wife of, Bill Clinton, and he was the president, and that was the issue that she was working on. And after about a year, I thought, I could never do this. Like to spend my life working on one thing like universal health care. We still arguably don't have that.
Yes.
And here we are in 2025. So I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go on the corporate side. So I went to grad school at NYU and moved up there, and I thought I was going to be this corporate lobbyist.
What'd you go to grad school for?
Public administration.
Okay.
I wanted the public policy background to be this corporate lobbyist. This was my goal. So I walk into my first class, first day. I'll never forget the professor. I won't name him, but it was Intro to Public Policy 101, and the assignment was, we want you to write about an alternative to this policy. And the policy was allowing smoke in public places like bars and that kind of thing. And I raised my hand very innocently, and I said, oh, and we had to write about a policy alternative to that. I said, well, can I write about doing nothing as an alternative? And the professor looked at me and he said, no, because this is all about government intervention. And that's when I became a little disillusioned with, like, the government was going to solve everything. So
that was probably like a moment.
That was a moment. So I finished this.
You're like, what else are they doing?
Right. So I finished this degree program, and I'm like, I want to do something in international business. So I started looking in the help wanted ads and stuff. If we're going back pretty far here.
Yeah.
Before Indeed and before the internet was really actually working. And I found a job at an aluminum trading company. So that was my strategic blunder that put me into this industry for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So that was the.
So you just saw like a classified.
Classified ad. They were looking for somebody to help work as an junior aluminum trader, doing import export. And I'd already been doing a little side hustling while I was in grad school, doing kind of like experimenting with like import export. And I thought it was glamorous and exciting and all of that.
You're like, I'll go do this while I find my real job.
Exactly. So it was in New York City. It was like a cool place to be. And I worked for this guy who I will not name, but I'll describe. He was an ex-Fibro trader. And the Fibro guys in the 80s and 90s were the guys that really led this whole commodity. They were the ones that were trading the oil, and then they got into metals, and they were Solomon Brothers was a competitor, but this is like kind of the
futures trading?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
and physical, so they would ship goods as well. So it turns out the guy I worked for, who was ex-Fibro, was trained under another person, ex-Fibro, who worked under Mark Rich. And if you remember Mark Rich, he was the aluminum trader that was defaulting on taxes or tax evasion, and then he fled to Switzerland, and he was the guy that Bill Clinton pardoned when he left office. Okay, so Mark Rich is sort of this, and he was the founder of Glencore, which is today arguably one of the largest mining and trading companies in the world, and he was the founder of that. So I felt like I was getting trained by impressive people in that, and I thought this was like this glamorous world. Well,
was dissolution number two coming?
Yes, dissolution number two. So Mark Rich, like, okay, he's a criminal and fled the country, and my boss studied under him, and so this is a true story. This is what happened. So I worked for the company. It was called Cometco, and if we get any listeners that ever traded, they'll know this company because it's kind of a famous story, and it burned an aluminum mill here in the U.S. So anyway, so the guy that ran my business was backed by an heiress to the drug, the Merck drug fortune.
Wow.
So he had really impressive financial backing, and he was going to create this global trading company, importing and exporting Russian-sourced aluminum all over the world and bring it to the U.S. for the first time, bring it to Southeast Asia. And so that was
big.
Going big. That was the plan. And I was just kind of soaking it up, learning Incoterms, using the Thomas Register green books, probably if you remember those. And I would literally cold call these companies in South Africa and Aruba, and crazy, like to get new business, right? Just total cold calling, dialing for dollars. Well, the business wasn't run particularly legitimately. It took me a little bit to figure some things out, but basically you're brokering a deal, right? You're importing, so you're opening up a letter of credit to your supplier, which was in this case the Russians, and then you have your customer open a letter of credit to you. We call them back-to-backs, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And it turns out my boss left the country and was, quote unquote, on a trip in Europe, working with other suppliers. And he calls me up one day, and I'm, 26 at the time or 24. I was young, stupid young,
Yeah.
And there was two other people in the office. One was a controller, very kind of nervous, ninny, OCD kind of person. And then somebody who was in the music industry who was just answering the phones. And I was kind of running logistics. And he called and he said, I need you to change the dates on the shipping documents because the bank's due in this week. And I'm like, okay. And his name's Danny, I'll say that much. So I hung up the phone and sat there and thought,
Feels wrong.
yeah, this not feeling good about this, So I come back and I tell the controller and I said, Danny wants us to change the dates on the shipping documents. And for some reason, this guy was like, okay, I'll get the documents. I'm like, whoa, I think we need some advice. So
Wow.
I called a friend. I was a kid. I had no mentor. I was a kid. My mentor was out of the country. And I said, what do you think? And super smart friend of mine, MIT undergrad. He's like, that smells like fraud.
Get away from that.
Get away from that. So it turned out that I actually had to call. So I knew who the owner was, and I was so intimidated. I'd meet them for Christmas dinner. It was in this, posh building on Fifth Avenue. And I mean, these guys were loaded. So this was this heiress to the Merck drug fortune's husband. So it was the husband that invested. And again, I won't name names. It was a very high-priced, fancy attorney that was also involved. And I had to whistleblow, and I just didn't know what to do. So I ended up calling their accountant who works with us. And I said, I think we have a problem. So he came, and anyway, the whole company became unraveled.
Really?
And we owed
And the accountant knew.
He
presumably.
He didn't know that anything was being doctored, nor did any of us.
Okay.
So I basically informed him, like, okay, Danny's asked me to do this, and I don't think this is kosher.
Oh, no.
Okay. He said, yeah, there's a few oh no's and some others.
Yeah.
And he had to call these owners and say, we got some problems here. Then Danny didn't come back to the United States. And then it really got crazy. We heard through the industry, the Russian mob had a hit out for him. He changed his name. This was so crazy. And he had stung at the time, I don't know if Century Aluminum, he owed them money for material that he had shipped and sold. And so they were stung with not getting receivables from that. If they end up listening to this podcast, they're going to I remember that.
This is like big time
this
stuff,
was
though.
right. But I was a kid. I was so can you what were you like when you were 24 or 25? You're just making your way in the world. You know a few things. You don't know this high stakes stuff, this banking stuff. So that was so I kind of helped sort of unravel
That was your
the business.
foray.
It was my foray into wow. So this guy was a crook, which actually leads me to my next story. But this was after in
So
MetalMiner.
this is you answered classifieds. This is where you ended up.
This is where I ended up. So I had this. So I learned a lot from him, right? So I learned how to trade metals from an import-export perspective. I knew all about the Incoterms, the banking documentation, I learned everything about international trade. So that was how I got my international trade. And I found it exciting, except a little repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it kind of has like a regular cadence to it. So you go, you try to get an order, you get an order, da-da-da. And then I kept saying, how's the internet going to disrupt this world this is a manual process where traders take advantage of customers didn't know suppliers in other countries, and suppliers in other countries didn't know customers in our country, right? So you're capitalizing on just the lack of knowledge.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, this is all going to go away because the internet's going to change all this. This was in 94.
Yeah.
Took a long time to get there. And traders, as you know, probably backward integrated into, well, we'll take title, we'll do the shipping, we'll warehouse the material, we'll kit, some of the distributor functions that distributors historically or service centers had always done. So,
and be a bank a little bit.
And be a bank and take on the risk. It was all about risk, which, by the way, is a theme, I think, in the markets today. And I think we're still fundamentally focused on helping companies manage risk.
Yes.
In a different way, the price risk of all of this. So that was my foray. So that was my...
Jesus.
Yeah, it was a little... Yeah, no, you're good.
That's... How did you feel about all that?
I felt like... Well, this was not what I expected to be doing in business, or like, and what am I going to do with my background working for somebody who, like, the company was liquidated. I mean, I was like selling the artwork. I still have one painting from the art. He had incredible taste. Danny was like fancy everything, Hermes scarves and fancy lunches and phenomenal artwork.
Is this person still gone?
This person reconstituted himself as another trading entity. I don't really know what happened to him. I know he moved back to Europe, changed his name, changed his company name. And so it was real
full reboot. Yeah.
Full reboot. So I'm like, how am I going to get a job?
Doesn't look good.
Yeah, with that kind of background. So I ended up doing some trading on my own with a partner for a little bit, kind of dabbled. And then I said, I've got to leverage this into something else. So I actually went into my second company that went bankrupt. Mm-hmm. Except this one was a really big company. It was Arthur Andersen.
Oh, yeah.
So
Big company.
So they hired me because they had just were growing their wholesale distribution practice, and they wanted people that had skills and knowledge of global trade. It was perfect. So that was a place where I could kind of walk into. No one had to explain to me what a container was or how things were shipped, financing. So that's that's where I learned a lot, just about how to do consulting, how to the Arthur Andersen way, et cetera.
And what happened there?
I have more funny stories there. So if you recall what happened there, that was the whole Enron scandal. Mm-hmm. So I had never worked for Enron. I just want to state that for the record.
You're like Forrest Gump. You're like all these
right.
major
The story
events.
Gets crazy. So then it even gets crazier. So I was working mostly with, I would say, mid-market manufacturers that were sourcing metal and wanted to figure out if they could be sourcing globally. They used to call it low-cost country sourcing.
Okay.
I became more of an expert in that,
okay.
And also working in the early marketplace models. So I was brought in for the, oh my gosh, there were so many of them. Constellium and chemicals, or there was Spectrum Metals was the aluminum one that Alcoa.
Was it E-Metals? Was that U.S.?
There was an E-Steel.
Okay.
Yes, there were just tons of these metals. And I kind of wrote Arthur Andersen's first white paper on these marketplaces. I interviewed everybody. I interviewed people at free markets. And so
Did you offer up an opinion on that at that time?
I did.
What was your conclusion?
Oh my gosh. I have to share this. I wrote an article with my now husband. We wrote it in 1999 saying that most of these marketplaces were going to be junk and worth nothing. I
mean, I should read that, and perhaps I have. But why did you guys think that at that time?
Because most of them were focused on the wrong. They weren't solving the actual problem. And I think about what you do at Bryzos, and your approach to the problem is totally different. See, most marketplace models think all we need to do is take the catalogs of a bunch of suppliers and get a bunch of buyers in here, and people are going to be able to just buy, again, going after transactional business, which, I know you guys are focused on. They thought that, but that's not actually how a lot of people buy. They're buy on contract, right? So it was hard and the mills, you think of an Alcoa who's participating in one of these marketplace models, they want to sell on contract largely. They're not doing transactional, not as much, certainly.
No, they want to know what's going on in the future.
Book their capacity and whatever. So a lot of these marketplaces just missed the mark, and they thought that certain things don't lend themselves well to catalog. Others do. What you guys are doing is very specific. It's parts. But if you're buying like sheet and coil, not all of it is catalog-ish. It's based on the width and the gauge and the outer and the finish and the coating and the wrapping, the packaging. And is it eye to the sky? And what's the inner tube, outer tube? There's all sorts of variables that impact the price, impact what people quote. So, and also, I think people treated direct materials at the time differently. They treated it the same as they would as you're buying MRO, if you're buying like toilet paper and gloves and oil, and they're not the same. A strategic purchase is different. If you're putting aluminum on an automotive vehicle, there's a quality standard that has to be met that just doesn't lend itself to, at the time, the simple marketplace models that existed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the B2C playbook doesn't work in B2B.
No.
And actually, I'll take it a step further, which I coined, which is metals. Online metals is not even B2B, in my opinion. It's eye to eye, industrial to industrial. It's like this whole other category of thinking. And I think that thinking about it really in terms of B2B is maybe going to maybe closing your thinking a little bit, because I think it's not that. I think you can't necessarily say, oh, it's a B2B model, we'll apply it to metals.
Right.
I just think that would be catastrophic. And having iterated our platform over time, I can tell you firsthand that just taking a B2B concept and trying to apply it to a supply chain, at least in metals, which is the only thing I can speak to, it just didn't work. It's something different.
And there's plenty of carcasses around to tell us that that's so, right?
Which is amazing. I mean, I get it, how that occurs, because it's still tied back to the dot-com era to a degree, which is, no, this is how marketplaces should work.
Right.
And there's Amazon out here, which is always the one people point to. You just go do that and do it well. But when you get to the world of supply chains, I'm finding that's not true.
And it's so different when for example, you might have tooling that and dyes and things that you've developed for your direct material purchase. That was never accounted for in the marketplace models in the early 2000s. People forgot that, there's all these different parameters. There's different it's not that even just the standards. I think it's the anonymity that you're just going to go there and just kind of shop around for your key strategic. It just doesn't happen. The world doesn't work like that.
No, they want to know if they get in a jam, and I'm talking contract business, really, that they've got a partner for their business.
Right.
Whatever the circumstance is, they're tying themselves up to this other company, which is, you could argue that to a degree there may not be a marketplace opportunity in that world.
Exactly.
And it is going to be in transactional because, as you and I've discussed, that is the least loyal, highest velocity, and you need it right now. And buyers typically are like, I don't really care where I get this at this moment. This is kind of the price I need to be near that price, and I need it here at this time. Right. And I kind of don't care where it comes from.
Right.
I just need it.
Yeah, and the old those marketplace and I think still today a lot of people get those marketplace models wrong.
Yeah.
Well, they still apply that same thing.
When there's also the idea of that if you don't have somebody from that domain who's developing that software, you get heavily influenced by their consumer habits, and that you can't bring those into this equation.
Right. There's too many other parameters that have to go. And, we haven't even talked about things like, delivery requirements and all of the ways things need to be packaged at certain locales. And, there's all sorts of requirements, or fill my can ban. Those aren't things that also lend themselves readily to the circa 2000 marketplace models.
Yeah, and I've thought that I agree with that. And one other difference being that B2C is so formulaic now, where if I buy some tennis shoes or something, the moment I check out, that transaction just ended effectively.
Yeah.
It's going to go through a credit card rail and everything's going to go. In materials, that's when the transaction begins.
That's right. That's right.
Is now because I've just put something into play, and now we're going to see what we have.
Right. Exactly.
I think an obvious thing once said.
Yes.
But I think you have to have been in it to really get it.
It's totally different. It's totally different. And that's the difference between we can split the word transactional. In direct material purchasing, transactional can be very strategic.
Yes.
Right? There's a certain quality standard. I'm sure you get this on your platform where people need certain quality standards for the material that's coming in, or certain specifications. So it matters. And that's not always the case when you're buying some object on, a consumer product on. You're not maybe checking that. You're not sourcing to say, was this shoe made from a non-labor, blah, 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 manufacturer? Some people can do that. But again, the behaviors are different, B2C, B2B.
Yeah, I mean, it's there are ties that bind it. That there are all these, as you know, the restrictions that live around these transactions, which need to be considered. But so back to your journey.
Yes, I was doing that at Arthur. Okay, so what happened? I have to tell the last Anderson story because it was the best. So one morning, back when people still got papers delivered, like newspapers, somebody calls me and says, "Oh my God, you're on the front page of the business section of the Chicago Tribune." I said, "What?" And I pull out the paper, and it is a picture of me walking out of Arthur Andersen headquarters carrying binders. I look like I was weighed down with a bunch of binders and boxes. The implication, and the headline said, "Arthur Andersen rocked by scandal." And the implication was that I was walking out of the building to the shredder. That was the joke about Enron, right? The documents were shredded. So literally, I came to the office the next day, and people called me Shredder. I literally got this nickname as if I was the one. Mind you, I've never stepped foot in Houston in my whole time that I worked at Arthur Andersen. Never stepped foot there, never touched Enron, never was involved with any of that. But anyway, so that was my second company that I had worked for.
2 for 2 here.
I was 2 for 2, and I started to get a little bit of and here everyone said, "Oh, go work for Arthur Andersen. It's the best brand in the world. It's a super safe company. They're stellar reputation, blah, 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 blah." But by the time, it was around when I got married in 2001, the company I could see was unraveling. And I remember somebody explaining to me, my boss at the time was explaining, I said, "Why can't they just spin out that part of the business that did Enron?"
Right.
I remember him saying, "No, it's kind of like a cancer that's already metastasized, and it's kind of all over, and it can't be cut out anymore."
Jeez.
So that was my second. So that was a good.
Back to the drawing
Okay, so
board.
our group went to Bearing Point, and I spent my time at Bearing Point mostly working for Motorola in a giant. It was one overarching project of 60 sub-projects, and I don't mean to trash Bearing Point or the project, but it was awful. And I was working killer hours, and so I ended up leaving Bearing Point to go to Deloitte Consulting, which I thought, actually Deloitte and Touche, which I thought was, they were spinning out their consulting firm, so that I was thinking, oh, I can stay more local, I can have local clients, they're spinning out the consulting arm. So the weekend I gave my resignation to Bearing Point. Deloitte Consulting, which was going to be Braxton, decided they would not spin out and instead we're going to reintegrate. So I was back to, I literally traded one job for another job. I had basically the same job and I was traveling all over. So this time though at Deloitte, my client was Caterpillar. So I spent 14 months at Caterpillar and learned a lot. And again, metal sourcing. So flash forward, we were starting our family. I'm like, I cannot be on the road like this. And I think a line job. So you basically in consulting have two choices. You have a line job, which is where you can grow and become partner, or you get a staff job. And if you get a staff job, I don't want to trash people that have staff jobs, but let's just say they're less high growth, less high earning potential, et cetera, tend to be a little more static of what you're doing.
Right. Okay.
Not on the partner track, et cetera.
Different objectives.
So I felt like, I don't really want to do a staff job. I feel like I'm more entrepreneurial. I want to do something else.
Yeah.
And my husband at the time, so we had met also through all this B2B marketplace stuff. He worked for Free Markets. We met at a B2B Net Market Makers conference. So we're all marketplace everything. Like we really are marketplace.
What a bunch of nerds.
Bunch of nerds in the marketplace. And he was doing kind of M&A and that kind of thing. And after we had our first kid, so this was in 2003, this was back when we used to use the Zagat's to find out what restaurants are, before all the good like Open Table and Yelp and all that.
It's like Zagat's and Fodor's.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Got the whole cover.
There you go. So we have our first kid and, we're not doing it with any help. We're going to figure this out. And so, you're doing the round the clocks and the shifts and the baby thing. And so one day I walk into the den, which is where he was working at Free Markets, and he is sitting there picking out restaurants and wines. And I looked at him and I said, you need to go to the office. You need to go downtown and pretend like you're working because like have no sleep and I'm like going. So he goes downtown and starts working with like a company that Free Markets had acquired. And then I think he was getting kind of itchy. And so I said to him, well, one of us needs to quit and start something. So we really were kind of like, It could be you, it could be me. What do you want to do? And we decided I actually had probably the better job at the time. So he went and started his company, which became Spend Matters. Another fun story, our first client in that business was the now Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania. So Dave was at Free Markets and he ended up hiring Spend Matters, my husband at the time, to do some work. And that's how we...
And what did Spend Matters do?
Initially, we were doing... It's interesting, kind of analyzing technology and technology stacks from different providers and then providing competitive intelligence. That's still what the company does today, but it was more primitive back then, more in the form of white papers and things like that.
Okay, so you were kind of researching, vetting?
Research, yeah. So that's kind of what Spend Matters did, and then we kind of hemmed and hawed, and I ended up only about 6 months later starting a company called Apteam Global, which was essentially a consulting firm helping companies with direct material sourcing, which is what I was doing at Caterpillar, global sourcing, et cetera. But this is where the part where I couldn't get out of the metals industry. All the projects people would call us for always were metal projects, stampings, fabricated parts, semi-finished sheet and coil, et cetera. So we were doing some consulting business. And then at the time in 2004, Jason started a blog called Spend Matters. So he ran a company. It was his old partners, but the blog was called Spend Matters. And I thought, that would be an easy one, kind of what you guys are doing here with your podcast, right? That would be a good marketing vehicle for my consulting business. So we started and we thought, well, what will we call it? I don't know. So we hired a branding consultant. We're like, we're going to call it MetalMiner. Okay. And that was a blog site. That's literally what we did.
That's where you started.
That's where we started. And we wanted to consult and use that as a means to consult. And but what we ended up doing was getting people angry, and that's another story. But basically, we started off the traffic. We used to laugh. You can appreciate this. We the first few weeks were like, wow, we got like 5 readers, and we're all excited. I'm like, well, that was me, you, my mom, your dad,
Yeah.
And so like that was how we, right?
Hadn't totally arrived.
Hadn't totally arrived. Then, we had like 20 readers in a day or whatever. So then, I remember when we, kind of hit, I don't know, it was a few hundred readers in a month or whatever it was. It was like the threshold, but it was sort of like some hockey stick growth.
Right.
We started getting like 5,000, 10,000. I'm like, wow,
so
there's people that we don't even know that are listening to this or reading this or whatever. And we were much more whimsical, and our voice was almost like it was way less corporate. It was much more, we were funny.
Let it fly.
We used to write stories like, I'll never forget this. I wrote a guide on stealing scrap metal, stealing.
Yeah.
So we basically wrote like humor around like, you don't really want to be stealing bleachers. They're kind of bulky. So when you kind of rip them up, and we recommend like if you're going to take a manhole cover, like wait until steel's at least X dollars per ton, or it's just not worth the wait. So
you
it was like
time the market.
Time the market. So it was just this parody almost.
Yeah.
I mean, we got tons of traffic, tons.
Isn't it crazy?
It was silly. It was absolutely silly. We wrote a story on what do you call them? Grills, for your teeth with the gold. I hate to say it, that is our number one most trafficked piece of content of all time.
Is it really?
Yes. And of course, you realize that you also, when you're doing these outreach efforts, you also want to pull in people that can actually help your business, right? Help you grow your business. And so, we hired a Google exec who basically said, you probably don't want to be writing about that because that's probably not your target market.
How did you discover that you wanted to write an article about grills? Like, how'd you get there?
I'm trying to think if I wrote it or somebody else. I have no idea. I think we wanted to do something fun and whimsical at least one day a week. We wanted to write about something that was like basically pushing the idea of like supporting metals as an industry in general and all the different use cases of metals.
Okay, what's made of metal?
So it was like a Fun Friday, right? It's a Fun Friday piece. We've done some other great ones like that I think are practical. For example, if any of you have some male listeners, I just want to say rose gold is not a thing. It is a total ripoff. So you should never buy rose gold. And the reason for that is that it's mixing a base metal with a precious metal. So copper is a base metal. It's really cheap compared to the price of gold. But that's what gives gold its pink color, a la rose gold. So we actually did a little fun story looking at Tiffany and how much they're charging for, rose gold, not to trash Tiffany, but rose gold is...
Sorry, Tiff.
Yeah, sorry, but rose gold is a no-go. So, we would write fun pieces like that. So that's how I think the grills piece kind of came about, because we were like, there's a lot of gold in that. And, now people are doing all sorts of weird things. They're like doing gemstone stuff like on their skin and,
Yeah. People get bored. They start doing all sorts of different things. So you guys brought in a Google marketing consultant?
Yes. So she was high rank. She's a friend of mine. She was high ranking at Google, and she kind of came in here and basically whiplashed us into sort of understanding, like kind of whipped us into shape, basically saying, you guys are jumping from all these different things, and you really need to think about your core audience. Who are you going after? What are you trying to convey to that audience? I don't think the grills audience is your buying audience, as an example. So
how'd you guys feel about that when you heard somebody, there's kind of reining you in, right? And saying, are you guys serious about what you're doing or not?
Right.
And if you are, so how did you guys feel? Were you still sort of, you brought the person in to help you, but you're like, I don't know if she totally gets this.
It was a mixed feeling, because actually I was more worried about how much traffic we would lose, because all those fun pieces were driving in big traffic.
Right, okay.
And all she made was like a super obvious statement, but our business wasn't paying attention to it, which was, you got to make your site work for your business. Like, you're not there just to be whimsical and silly or entertaining. Like, we didn't have a revenue stream from that unless you could monetize it. Which we had sponsors at the time. So we've had sponsors of the website. That was the revenue stream. Okay. And then we would do consulting on the side, not on the side, but that was our business. We would do like a gain share consulting thing. And we did that for a bunch of years, and then just merged that business into Spend Matters and kind of operated both companies. It's a long story.
Well, so your husband goes in because you had the better sort of steady job situation. He went with Spend Matters. How long did it take for you to jump and get with?
Not long, because he's an animal. So he started Spend Matters, I think, in January, February of 2004. And then I ended up quitting. I left Deloitte in 2004, like by the summer of 2004. And then I was doing my consulting on the side, and he was running this business. And we did that for a number of years until 2010. And then we merged both companies together because we were doing a lot of the same things. It was kind of like shared services, right? Like we don't really have two sets of books and two sets of this and for these little businesses. So we put them together, but kept MetalMiner as its own like little operating group. And so kind of separate investments. And it got a little complicated, which is why we kind of decided let's, really grow and blow out the Spend Matters part of the business. It had more momentum, more revenue, more clients. And then we built that and sold that to private equity in December of 21, and then spun out MetalMiner to let it grow and thrive on its own and create its own, and that's really when we built the platform in 2019. So that's when MetalMiner really transformed from, let's say, blog and some consulting to more of a SaaS platform data company.